Let's roll. Action. Q, so is this your first time on a podcast?
No, but it's my first time on the podcast
All
with
right.
Hermeus.
Well, welcome.
Yes, it's great to be here.
Awesome.
I've had a really good day.
Awesome. Yeah.
I really enjoy the vibe of the company,
Mhm.
and the team is just an outstanding team.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate that, and really
Yeah.
appreciate you taking time out of your very busy retired schedule to come
right,
down and visit with
right,
us.
right. I had to walk away from my gardening.
Yeah, I noticed.
That's very important.
Very good. Well, for everybody at home listening, AJ, CEO, got Zach Shore, VP of Growth, and a special guest today, Lieutenant General, retired, Clint Hinote, with us today. So, I think first off, Q, we'd love to hear a little bit about your background, who you are, where you've been, and we'll get into the discussion.
Okay. Well, so I have been out of the Air Force for a little bit over a month and a few days, which is very weird feeling because I had served for 35 years in the Air Force. I left home when I was 17 years old and went to the Air Force Academy. And I've never been able to grow a beard ever since then. So the day after,
they just wouldn't come out of your face.
Well, when I was 17, I probably couldn't have grown a beard. Yeah. So the day after I had my last day in the office, I began growing this beard right here. And of course, I told the team earlier, I've got some catching up to do, especially with all the great beards that I've seen walking around the factory. So when I was young, I didn't think I wanted to join the military. It ended up that I found out about this place called the Air Force Academy, and I found out they had a football team. I was playing football at the time, and I ended up wanting to go to the Air Force Academy. It ended up being a life-changing experience for me, obviously. I met a bunch of great people. I saw a great mission. And the whole part about like coming together as a team to do something important really spoke to me. And so I didn't know that, I certainly didn't expect that I would make the Air Force a career when I first went to the Air Force Academy. I was really just kind of wanting to get an education and get a good start. And it just ended up that this was just something that really spoke to me. And I kept on progressing through. So I graduated from the Air Force Academy. I told a story earlier today that I actually lost my qualification medically to go fly. So I ended up going to Harvard's Kennedy School for 2 years while that sorted itself out, which was a huge blessing and opportunity. Afterwards, I went to pilot training, got through pilot training, got through jet training, was a fighter pilot for quite some time. Ended up, those were the days of the no-fly zones over Iraq. And so a lot of my deployments were policing the no-fly zones, both in southern and northern Iraq. And I flew F-16.
Down in Southern Watch, flying an F-16?
I was in Southern Watch flying an F-16, and so I ended up transitioning to the F-117, the stealth fighter, and the stealth fighter is they're both amazing aircraft, the F-16, the F-117. I did that for about 5 years. And then went on to a series of staff assignments, including some education, and then going and serving on different staffs. At one point, I ended up getting pulled into the Central Command Air Forces. So I was the primary strategist for the Air Forces during the surge in Afghanistan, or in Iraq. When General Petraeus was putting together his surge, we were planning out how we would support it in the air. And that was just one of the many staff assignments that I had. So I got through a lot of those staff assignments. I ended up being able to be a squadron commander and a wing commander. My wing command was in Korea. I was the leader of Kunsan Air Base. And about 2,000 Americans, none of them had their families, including me. And for a year, it was just an amazing place to be and to serve with all these great Americans. And I fell in love with the Korean people. I just think the world of what they have done with the chance that they had after their civil war, and it's just an amazing success story. So after that, I got a chance to go to the Council on Foreign Relations for a year. So I never thought that I would actually be in New York City, especially as a military person. But it was such a good opportunity. And that is where I started to hear about the world of venture capital and how it's changing the world and where the innovation culture is going and all that. Because a lot of the people who were in the Council on Foreign Relations were also in investment companies, Blackstone and things like that. And many of them were trying to leverage private capital in the innovation ecosystem. And so that was something that we talked a lot about. And it's a reason why I became interested in this part of defense. After that, Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work pulled me from New York to work in his office. And he's considered to be one of the big thinkers of the DoD. And so that allowed me, it challenged me to think more broadly about change and what that means. So, I had this opportunity to see how the economics of the United States are changing, and then I had this opportunity to see how the military requirements for the United States are changing. I went for a year to Iraq. That was my last deployment. I served in the embassy during the time when the Iraqis were fighting ISIS. We were helping them. And that was a nasty, hard fight, but ISIS really was defeated during that time, and I was glad to be a part of that. And then I came back to my last 5 years in the Pentagon, and during that time, I was placed in this kind of space of how are we as a Defense Department, as an Air Force, going to change now that we know that great power competition has come back and China has become our primary challenger. And that was not something I expected, and it consumed me in both a good and a bad way. And that's how I met you guys. I heard about you first, and what I saw was all of these different entities, to include some very forward-leading companies like Hermeus, who collectively could really change the ballgame. And what I think is that we haven't been leveraging that part of the American economy enough. And I think that we are slowly changing, but not changing fast enough. And so one of the reasons why I'm here, I told you this morning, is I want to see companies like Hermeus do well. We need a few unicorn Hermeus type companies because it's so important that the model that is creating innovation in the public sector, in the private sector, be applied to the public sector. And I think you guys are really leaders in that space. So that's a little bit about me and why I would be interested in this idea of the future combat forces, serving the future airmen or the future soldiers, the future sailors, and it was something that I got a chance to do these last 5 years. Led Air Force Futures for 3 of them, and it was a absolute wonderful time for the team that I got to work with and the people all throughout the innovation ecosystem that I got to meet, and that included you guys. And that's how I got a chance to close out my career, and it has been a wonderful 35 years. And now I'm trying to figure out who am I in this next chapter. And so it's been really great to come down for the day, and I'm inspired by all of the things I've seen.
It's great. Well, thank you for your service. You've done you've put in the time for the country. There's no question about that. And now comes the fun part. So, in your most recent position, really focused on the future force, 2030 beyond, the making sure that, we want to make sure that we get to a great future, and we want to make sure that we can keep that great future.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about kind of what that job is and how the Air Force actually makes decisions about what they're going to pursue in the future. Are we literally like playing war games like Risk with dice and stuff?
Sometimes. Yeah. I mean, honestly, in fact, some of the best war game, just as an aside, some of the best wargaming teaching is being done at Quantico at the Marine Corps War College. And in fact, there is a real course that teaches wargaming. And for the students to graduate, they have to design a wargame. And in a lot of times, you use a dice it is somewhat like Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, I just ordered the Dungeons and Dragons table for my family, so that we can have fun together playing games. But wargaming is so much more than that. And to get at your real question, which is, how does a service like the Department of the Air Force make these difficult decisions about what we're going to do for the future force? It's hard. And in fact, it is something that I think it's a skill set that atrophied quite a bit after the Cold War was over. And then 9/11 came around. And as Zach, as we were talking earlier, we're just completely consumed by the war on terrorism. And so you didn't have to, say, for example, modernize your force very much. We did incrementally. There were areas where we were like, okay, we're going to do this, but generally the modernization of the force was pretty slow. And most of the people who are leaving now grew up in that time. And so what they have done, what we have done, is tried to rebuild the skill set about thinking what could the future look like, what are some of the capabilities we could develop to get to a better future, how does technology play in that? How does the development of people play in that? How does that come together? How do we work with industry partners? How do we understand what's going on in academia? Because honestly, a great way that we understood AI is through academia. And actually, I'm very glad that we were in that space. To get a little bit more granular at what we try to do. So the way that we think about warfighting in the future is you have to kind of think about, okay, how would we win in the future? And that becomes the story that you tell yourself about how the future looks like winning is a concept. Like conceptually tell me how we're going to win. And this gets into the services developed concepts of warfighting. And as you all know, there's a joint warfighting concept right now. And we were heavily involved in both in these last 5 years. And so the wargaming allows you to test and come up with new concepts. And so you can plug in capabilities and you can like say, hey, that worked really well, or that didn't really do much at all. And so a lot of our wargaming has been testing out different capabilities and concepts and different mixes and recipes of that. That begins to give you a level of understanding about what it is that you're going to have to do. And then you start driving some, I use the word requirements very carefully. I was the chief of requirements for the Air Force. I believe it's impossible for someone to know what the warfighter requires in 10 years. I just don't see it. And I was it, right? No one gave me a crystal ball. I did get one of those 8 balls that you shake.
Yeah, everybody, this is how we actually make decisions.
Yeah, right, exactly. You know, I always say, okay, well, are we going to be able to defeat China in the future? And you shake the 8 ball and you go, only time will tell. So we needed a beginning of a story for how the fight gets better. And the war games helped us develop that story. That grew into a set of concepts. It became the joint warfighting concept. And now we can start developing requirements out of that concept. Those requirements are helpful for understanding what the service needs to invest in. So every service should see themselves in the joint warfighting concept and in the investments that they make. Recently, with the Department of the Air Force, the big thing that changed was the leadership of Secretary Kendall. So he came in and he knew that the Air Force had to change and grow to be able to face the challenge that China's going to present to us. And he came in with a plan, and we talked a lot about the needs that we had. And the way that he wanted to lead through change management in the Air Force was through his imperatives. And so he outlined 7 operational imperatives that are and they're imperatives, meaning that if we don't do these things, we can expect the Air Force will not be ready or relevant in a conflict with China. So the last several years have been fleshing out those imperatives, which were totally in line with joint warfighting concept, totally in line with the requirements coming out of that. And because of all that, we felt like we were aligned really well as a department. And what we found was the technologies were available. I tell people we do not have an innovation problem in the United States. We got more innovation than we could ever use. And that some of that's classified, highly classified. Some of that is not classified at all. And some of it lives in this never land. But we've got plenty of innovation. And that's just a testament to the United States and the people of the United States. What we have is an innovation adoption problem. And we have talked a lot about that today and before. And so we are trying to figure out how to adopt those technologies and change them into capabilities. And that's really the art right now that's really consuming not only the Air Force, you're getting a lot of this in the Marine Corps, for example, because they're really changing a lot and adapting. And I'm very impressed with their leadership, the leadership of General Berger, for example, and what he has done to manage change in the Marine Corps. So that's a long way of answering the question, but it's a very complex way. I mean, when you think about what you have to invest in the future, you can't just like throw dice on the dice board. What you can do is use the gaming, develop the concepts, use as much analysis as you have access to, modeling and simulation, develop the requirements, talk about how the technology might fit those requirements and bring it all together.
Yeah. So, sir, one thing I wanted to kind of tease out that you talked about, we talked about off camera, was the GWAT era.
Yeah.
Right? So 20 years post 9/11 of fighting the war on terror and the impact that that's had and how we see that today. So specifically, we're focused on the Air Force because we're building an aircraft and we've got, an Air Force senior officer here. What would you tell other aspiring new entrants, startups about the current transformation that's occurring in the Department of Defense and really specifically the Air Force and what that means for folks like us and how we should approach the department? And as one more comment, I do think sometimes, especially for people who haven't worked with the department before and don't know about that story and all the recaps going on, there is an unreasonable set of expectations. So I would love to hear, maybe you talking to that audience. And some of that.
There's a lot to unpack there. But yes, I agree. So the war on terrorism, like we were talking about, it consumed us. It consumed the department. There was a time when the Secretary of Defense said we have to focus on the war we're in, not the war we might fight. And that sent a very clear message about modernization throughout the Pentagon. And so in many ways, because we're waking up to the challenge of Russia and China, we see Ukraine and we know that this is real and we know we have to change. It feels like we're catching up. It feels like we're kind of and doubling up to catch up, right? I mean, it feels like we have to move and change a lot. And so what is happening inside the government, inside the DoD, is there's so many different things we have to do. And you feel overwhelmed. You know there are all these people that are out there that want to help. Honestly, you feel like, I don't even know, like, how to get through this day. There is so much that has to be done in such a short time frame. And as we were talking before, there's always the unexpected occurrence. Like there was never a day in the Pentagon where everything went exactly like I thought it would. And so you're constantly changing, you're constantly reacting. And so what that translates into is it's really difficult to spend time with company by company by company, one-on-one. Because if you did that, with all the companies that want to talk to you, you never do anything else. And so, and I know I've done this with you guys, is I just didn't have enough brain bites to be able to give you all the time that I wanted to give you, just honestly. And that's probably true of most people that are in the positions of leadership, especially those that have multiple portfolios. So your action officers, where there's one thing they do, they probably have time to interact with you. But man, once you start getting to the level of executive leader, it's really hard. What does that mean? It means that we probably seem like we're scatterbrained. It seems like we're not interested. That's not true. We're really tired. There's probably a sense of we don't get it. And there are times when we don't get it. That's fair. But I also think that leads to some frustration that manifests itself in an unhelpful way. And as an example, I know that there are people, companies, think tanks, people who write articles who basically said if the DoD would just change like I told them to, everything would be fine. And I read those and I kind of laugh sometimes because one, most of the time it's not something we haven't thought about, but they're not aware of the constraints and restraints that are there. So what does that mean for a company that wants to do business with DoD? Well, the primes are used to this. This doesn't faze them at all. They just go on with their life. And they have processes and time frames and just generally business models that survive that. What is a lot more difficult is using a startup or a venture capital funded startup entrepreneurial company. That model is really difficult to break into. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know.
We're
live this.
gluttons for punishment.
But at the same time, companies like that have changed the United States military for our whole history. This is not. I mean, there have been great advances by small entrepreneurial groups literally since the Civil War. And it's worthy of y'all knowing that. And that will not change. I absolutely believe that some of the visions of these companies that I got a chance to know are going to change the military. Now, what does it feel like when you're on the outside? I suspect it feels like we're not listening. We just don't know the stupid, we're stupid. We don't know the thing to do and all that. And what I would counsel people is the Americans who get up and work in DoD every morning, the vast majority of them want to do well by the American people. They're not going there and going, I'm going to quash this company today. They want to do what's right, but the bureaucracy does cast incentives that are very difficult for young companies to work through. So we were talking about being a victim. The first thing I'd say is you're not a victim. Go and boldly tell your story. There is nothing wrong with telling a bold story. Yes, people will go, oh, I don't believe that. I whatever. That I think it is important, and this is something that I really compliment you guys on, is when you cast your vision, you weren't arrogant about it, but you guys have a bold vision. And that really impressed me when I was on the inside. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to come down today and meet the team. And what I think is important for a young entrepreneurial company is to first off, yes, it's going to be tough. There's going to be ups and downs. Get over it, right? The other thing, though, is there is a lot of goodness in understanding the customer. And again, I think this is something you guys have done a good job of, is you spent the time necessary to understand the people, the cultures, understand that there is no one Air Force, there's no one DoD. It's a bunch of people trying to do the best they can, and they all have different incentives, and they're all different people. Now, I think one of the things that I think we're going to get better at is in understanding the time frames of venture capital and what that requires. And I always hate to use the word requires. What it means that the government has to do to take advantage of it. And I think we're going to see some pretty big changes in that. We've talked about it a lot, and of course, I don't like talking about things. I like enacting legislation and putting new processes in place and things like that. I would also. One of the things I think is that Congress has actually been pretty good about opening up new avenues
Yeah, I
for entrepreneurial companies.
Yeah.
And I think there is some fear within the bureaucracy of using some of the new processes that the Congress put into place, because what happens if it goes wrong?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're always, no. Somebody said the other day, nobody ever lost their job by hiring McKinsey.
Mm-hmm.
You're always safe if you do it the traditional way. Well, that can't be true, and here's why: because the risk you're running is the risk of tomorrow's airman, tomorrow's sailor, and so at some point, some leader's going to come along and go, I don't really care about the risk of what you're talking about, but I do care about when this thing gets fielded in the hands of the warfighter. And that will shift the incentive structure. And I know to a great degree for entrepreneurial companies right now, it feels like you're holding your breath underwater while you wait for the world to change. And I think it is changing. It's changing too slow. I think that there is also a growing sense among investors that understand that there's a time frame involved with working with the government that is longer than the typical Silicon Valley time frame, and that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Now, they'd like it not to be true, and I would like it not to be true. But to some degree, there is a little bit more leeway in VC firms, in some of the individual investors, in understanding that when you work with the government and the value proposition is you're going to sell to the government, yeah, you're probably not going to be able to do that like really well in 2 years. And so there are some people, I think, who are open to that, especially as they see the promise of the company and the technology and what it could mean. And I think that's true. I think that's why it was really impressive, the capital series you've raised already. So just to kind of recap, I think there's reasons for everything. There are incentives. If you're a young entrepreneurial company, we need you. The United States needs that innovation. Don't be the victim. Ride the ups and downs. Get to know your customer. Explain your story. Be bold about it. And look for the investors that understand working with the government.
That's a big point that I don't think gets discussed enough, is that who your investors are important, I think, as a reflection back to the DoD, as the DoD does more work with this community, because they can say, I know that you know, right? It's like a pre-screen, but also for an entrepreneur to have that support system for not just like advice on the product and the market acquisition approach, but managing expectations and things like that. So I also think that's a great point that's not discussed a lot, is the maturity of the VC community's relationship with the defense ecosystem.
Right. I've seen a lot of change there. And I mean, we've seen groups of investors, investment companies and individuals who have made the decision to invest in companies where they know the true delivery of value doesn't happen due to the budget cycle. Right. And, that one, I mean, God bless them. That's pretty patriotic with your money. But we need that. And I think it will get better. I do. I think there is eventually going to be a path that we can choose for a company that brings a technology or a grouping of technology or just a new way of thinking, and we see it, we see the value proposition in it, and we adopt it more quickly. I think there is going to be a pathway there. Yeah. I know people are talking about it. I know people are talking about it on Capitol Hill. And I just feel like that's where we're going to end up. Yeah. In a democracy, it goes slowly, and we're not. I would like to see that right now. We don't have as much of that as I think we need. But I get the sense that it's getting better. There's more opportunity for entrepreneurial companies to work with DoD and to bring what they're discovering and what they're inventing to DoD. And I'm pretty excited about that. I mean, I think it's going to get better and better.
Yeah. No, I would agree.
What kind of tools in the tool chest do you think DoD has to signal to that community?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you obviously spent your time in what's coming in the future, and generally when you're working in the deep tech space, you're not building something that's necessarily going to be here in a number of months. Like, it's a number of years until the project is available. But part of that innovation adoption problem within the DoD is like the pace of the way I like to frame it is the DoD generally works if you have a series of doors in a hallway, room to room. You're going to walk up to a door and then put your key in the door, and then you're going to walk through it, and then you're going to walk slowly, meander around, get to the next one. Whereas like in the startup world, everything happens in series, one after the other in the DoD world. And this is any bureaucracy. In the startup world, we're not like, strolling down the hallway waiting to put our key in the door. No, we are sprinting, running as fast as we can, and doing everything we can to make sure that when we get to that door, it's open.
Yes.
And we're willing to smack our face into the door, fall back and do it again and again and again until it goes. And like that willingness to hedge against like the uncertainty of like doing work that might be dead end work. I'm not just talking technical, I'm talking acquisition, whatever. How does the DoD get around that and signal in a time relevant way that can actually drive things forward faster?
Man, if I knew, it would be like nirvana, right?
You did ask us to ask hard questions.
No, and well, I'll tell you what I think. By the way, one of my executive officers told me a story about there was a cat living in a cabin with her owners. And there were 11 doors.
Was the cat alive or dead?
The cat was alive. And because we're all dog people here, right? So the cat was alive, and there were 11 doors to the outside. And the cat always was like one of the owners would open the door. The cat would look out. It's winter outside. It's snowing. Would not go out. And the joke is the cat was always looking for the door to summer. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's kind of what you all are trying to do. You're trying to find that one door that you can use to unlock the rest of the defense community. You talked about signaling. So there is an increasing awareness among leaders, and especially among maybe the rising leaders of DoD, and I think in Congress too, of the types of signaling that a venture capital looks for. And that if we could somehow give those signals, then venture capital would respond. And now we've got a symbiotic relationship with it. And that's not everybody. And there are people who just don't get it. It just goes right over their head. But I am seeing increasing awareness of this. So I think there's an acquisition side and a warfighter side. And in the warfighter side, you typically have the requirements community and to some degree the programming community. But let's just think of it as you've got the people that buy the stuff and you got the people that use the stuff. It is very likely that when a young company brings a technology, that it's very likely that somebody on the warfighter side sees it and understands that there will be, if you could incorporate that technology, it would be really helpful for the mission. And that what is unfortunate is that oftentimes that enthusiasm from the operator side, so the pilots if there's something that's an aircraft, or the sailors if there's something that's a ship, and oftentimes that excitement does not translate over to the buyer side. And so the buyer side is kind of like doing the same thing that it's always done, which is treating contractors. They have to treat them equally. And some people take that very literally. And because, but that could be the basis of a protest. And a protest that sticks is failure for a acquisition professional. Mm-hmm. And losing a war is failure for an operator, right? So those are different worlds, mm-hmm. and they don't necessarily have. One of the things I really like about Secretary Kendall's leadership is he brought those two worlds together in a way that has been pretty compelling, and that's really helped us move forward. And I think some of the things that you all have seen and other companies have seen recently has been that the warfighter is going, I know that you think this got some high risk in it, but we really need this. And then the buyers of the equipment go, okay, well then I can live with some risk in cost, schedule, and performance if I know that in the end the payoff is that the warfighter is successful even in the most challenging circumstance. So what that really means is twofold. The warfighter and the acquisition community have to be very close, and that has been leadership dependent in my experience. The good news now is I actually think they're very close. The second is the acquisition community has got to communicate to the companies through contracting, because there's no other way, that of the upside of the possibility. Like we just use your kind of plan as an example. So if Quarter Horse is able to fly and to come back and to fly again and to maybe, who knows, go up pretty fast. Well, at that point, there's a major upside to the program we call, or might call, Dark Horse. And what we want to be able to do, what I think we have to do if we're going to leverage venture capital, is to express some level of confidence in that upside. Now, that may not be realized, and there are a lot of people who might fall off the wagon. And I think you're going to see this in the CCA world, for example, is that there's a lot, CCAs is Collaborative Combat Aircraft, so we're carrying quite a few.
We're all about the jargon here.
Yeah. So
there's a disclaimer at the beginning. So
we're carrying a lot of vendors for the uncrewed systems and how they might fight in the future. I'm personally very excited about this. But there may be vendors who just don't hack it at some point, and they'll fall off, and that's okay. That's kind of what capitalism looks like. But there's an upside to the end of the tunnel there, that if a vendor survives and the product that they produce is so compelling that we're going to go buy a bunch. And this is why Secretary Kendall signaled that 1,000 is kind of the min that we're thinking about when it comes to CCAs. He did that specifically, and I think it was the right move to signal the upside to the investors and to the companies. So that's a good thing, but what is I don't think has happened yet is us or folks in the government understanding the power that expressing that upside would have with the VC, the companies and the individuals. And until we understand the power of influence that brings, we're probably not going to play that very well. And so we're kind of in that early stage of we're trying to figure this out. I actually have seen areas, your company is one, but I've seen others, where a very small amount of commitment with a potential upside communicated by the government has the potential to bring in 10x in private capital, and the company just gets going. I mean, it accelerates, and that's what winning looks like, right? For our innovation ecosystem, especially for the companies that want to work in defense problems. And so, long answer. I'm sorry, I'm long-winded today, but these are all really hard questions, and but that's what I think is, and that's kind of what success would look like.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think you really have to work hard to align the operational cadence of a startup and the operational cadence of its customer. And in this case, whether, so B2C, that's one thing. Everything's very fast. B2B, that's another thing. Enterprise sales, like you're talking months and months, and that's okay. But working with the government, it is years. It is years generally from when you have a product that works to having a contract signed to deliver that product. There's everybody likes to use the Valley of Death as an excuse for why we are not modernizing things better, why we're not transitioning technology. It's hard. Well, yeah, of course it is. But I'd argue that you don't need policy change. All the tools are there. You just need, and you hinted at this earlier, you need people willing to be creative within the bounds of what is ethical and legal and moral, of course. But to do something that hasn't necessarily been done before, or use something in a way that hasn't been used before, requires, you have to understand the physics of the system.
Yes.
You have to really know what you're doing, to know where what's gray and what's not. But like I think that is the challenge. That's the call, really. Like in this acquisition world, and that goes both for I think the DoD side, the customer side, but that's honestly the massive responsibility that lives on the company side. Like we cannot sit here and expect like, hey, DoD, we're building this cool stuff. Please figure out how to buy it from us faster. No, like that is our homework to do, and that is our like road to go lay, so that the customer can actually walk down it. And I mean, this is literally how we spend too much of our time. Trying to figure out how to do this, and like you're going to build all these tributaries that aren't going to work, but you only need one. You only need one that actually works.
That's true. I really am impressed with your willingness to travel that road, and to be willing to understand the customer so well that you're willing to offer the how as well as the what. And I have to tell you that I on the inside appreciated that, and I think it has the potential to be very successful for both sides. That said, I know it's not easy, and I know it feels uncomfortable for both of you, and it should. And I think your point about the different cadences is so interesting. And if there was ever anybody incentivized to like move fast, it's the people who might die if they don't have what they need, right? And so I actually feel like there's a significant amount of urgency on even on the inside of DoD, even in some of the bureaucratic places. Now, what is so difficult is the what we call the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system. That system has been in place since McNamara in the 1960s. It came from the Ford Motor Company. It might have been a really good thing back then. I could debate that. It is a terrible thing right now. And no one is saying, so there would be people who would say, well, there has to be oversight of how we spend the taxpayers' money. Amen. I 100% agree. And in fact, I think that there are other models that allow for that oversight, particularly oversight by Congress, but also enough oversight within the Defense Department, the executive. I think there are models that could make that a ton better. And we have generally wanted to pursue the model of we budget every year. And it's like you clean the slate every year. I know of no organization other than the United States government that does that. There may be others, and I'm sure there probably are, but generally, any large organization that has to be relevant in a future time frame thinks across time frames, and they budget across time frames. And so, as an example, one of the things I've heard defense thinkers say is instead of budgeting program by program, where literally you are down to the last dollar in a particular program, let's try to make the programs into portfolios and give some executives somewhere the ability to move within the portfolio and be accountable for it. And that's where the oversight comes. Look, I will tell you, there are people within the Air Force who are fully capable of being accountable to Congress for how they would manage a portfolio. At the moment, they are not allowed to, and they're not going to get a budget this year until sometime around December if we get a budget. It just boggles your mind. Like, if we were truly scared of China, we would fix this. So there is a planning, programming, budgeting, and execution commission. And I am not going to hold my breath to see what they come up with. But this is, I believe, one of the fundamentals that has to change if we're going to stand up to China. And I think it will. I just think it hasn't changed yet.
Yeah. I think within that, the discussion here, and specifically PPPE reform, it goes back to what we talked about earlier and why I have a very leading question earlier about the victim thing. And it's a yes and scenario. Yes, it needs to change, and we need to endure through that moment. And I think I've had this rant a million times. I think I had it on the last time I was on this podcast, of the idea that the Defense Department is not a market. it's a customer. And if you
That's a great point.
and so you have to, because in a market environment, the flash to bang with a good idea and adoption is much quicker. And so I think a lot of times, companies, new entrants in particular, back to your point about how the primes have business models that can endure this, and new entrants don't. In part because new entrants don't come in with the expectation that they think having a good idea in and of itself unlocks the answer. And the reality is that's not the case. And until PPP reform sort of shifts that to have it more of a meritocracy with accountability and outputs, you have to come in with a business plan that, to your point before, you have to overly engage with the customer to understand them. You have to understand their timelines. You have to align your business milestones to their decision timelines. We talk about this internally a lot. You could have a milestone that slips by 1 week at the company, but that 1 week could have a 365-day decision.
That is possible.
Right?
Right.
Because you missed it, and they had a decision cycle in the Pentagon, and now you're into the next cycle.
They had to lock something in.
At some point. And so people, companies that haven't spent time with this customer I don't think appreciate that. But that's not to say that you can't get educated and be engaged, especially at the action officer level can provide a lot of that feedback. You don't need to go to the principal. And so, I really appreciate your commentary around PPP, but also about, not being a victim in this. You're going to have to come in and engage very openly. Maybe
a way of kind of turning that around, making it more of a positive thing, is your point about the government is really a customer. And let's face it, there is no one DoD, there's no one Air Force, there are people.
Right.
And so a great deal of what you have to do to be successful in selling to the government is developing those relationships. That could be positive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you probably like a lot of the people that you've been dealing with.
I deeply enjoy it.
And they're actually good dudes and dudettes. And
some you like to drink with, some you like to spar with.
Yeah, that's right.
No, that's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair. I understand that. But
at the end of the day, we're all fighting for the same thing.
Exactly.
Right? We're all going the same direction.
Exactly. And you get to meet new people. A lot of them are really interesting. So what I think maybe to encourage young companies, what you'd say is let's try to turn that, okay, it's not going to be I'm going to put the product out there and it's just going to get snapped up.
Right.
I'm going to develop a relationship. But I get to develop a relationship with some pretty cool people. And we're working problems together. And these problems are wicked and they're fun to try to solve.
Very fun.
And so if you could somehow create a vibe or a culture around that, that I think is really powerful. I kind of think that y'all have kind of cracked that nut. And it seems like y'all are developing relationships in ways that, one, they're powerful, but I think you're enjoying it too, generally. And that's a good life.
Yeah, as like a recovering engineer, they don't let me engineer anymore. But now I've moved on to engineering human systems.
And
I
this
get
is
a lot of joy around it. When you're engineering an airplane, you have to understand the physics of this, because that's what drives the constraints that actually drive how you find the right answers. Understanding the physics of a human system is not straightforward.
That's true.
The perception, I think, when you first encounter any human system is that people act irrationally, when really people actually act quite rationally within their own frame. And the key is understanding that frame and operating within it. And around it at a tighter OODA loop than they do. That's
you basically you said your spouse just got her master's in public administration.
Yeah, that's right.
So you just summarized a lot of public policy school right there. Is that people generally do act rationally within the bounds that they see. So it's their incentive structure. And a big part of changing an organization is changing the incentive structure for individuals. And that's what we're going to end up having to do. So I think that, I really feel like you guys have a good beat on this. And this is true. The day that Dark Horse flies, there will be people throughout the government and people who are formerly serving in the government who, because of the relationships that you all have developed, they will be pumping the fist. They will be shouting and yelling and because it's good for America. It's good for the United States. And those relationships that you built mean that they're going to be picturing what AJ's doing and like what's going on in the flight console and all that kind of stuff. And
meanwhile, I'm just sweating, like ready.
Yeah,
to
no, that's probably true.
It's like penalty shootout in soccer.
Yeah.
I can't.
No,
watch them, I have to turn around.
that's probably true. But they will be pumping the fist, and they will be, because of the time you took to develop those relationships. They're rooting for you.
So I think that the way working with a customer like this actually works, it really comes down to trust. And trust is not something that is built quickly in a business to business relationship, let alone a business to bureaucracy relationship. Oh, I'm gonna coin that business to bureaucracy. It is B2B.
Yeah.
But like the best way for, I think, companies working with the DoD to build trust is like, you need to spend a lot of time with not just the senior leaders, but the action officers, the folks who are on the ground doing the work, the middle management in between as well. And it's a pretty straightforward frame. And frankly, like, this is how fundraising works. You say you're going to do a thing, and then you do the thing. And then the next time you say you're going to do a thing that's probably a little bit harder than that first thing you did, people pattern match that and say, okay, I see what you did here.
Right.
Now I'm going to extrapolate and say, like, the likelihood of you doing that next thing is pretty reasonable.
Yes.
And like that's how you do it. So it's communication and execution at the end of the day that drives everything. But when you're doing that in the area of developing a technology that like nobody has ever gotten right before, you have to set expectations at the beginning. That is like, hey, we have this plan, we're going to execute to it, but we're going to find things that break. Like, we will crash an airplane probably more than once. We're going to find things in a design that force us to go redesign again. Like, that is what happens when you go take on new problems. So you have to set that expectation at the beginning.
Yes. Of
like, as you're going through development, if we are not failing at a fast enough rate, that's what you should be yelling at us about. Not that you have planned this thing so perfectly and you have hit all of your milestones. No, it's all about learning. How quickly can you learn? How quickly can you pull that learning to the left? And it's not learned until whatever lesson it is enacted in the next thing.
I'm kind of thinking through, like, how would that approach ever be adopted by the government? And
I think if you gave contracting officers promotions for taking well thought out risks that didn't work.
Yes, incentivize.
Yeah, exactly.
And I also think that there is a growing crossflow of, and there's not a lot of cross, but there's some, but there's a growing crossflow of people who are experienced in the, try something big, fail, iterate, try it again, and eventually succeed. That one day somebody's going to get appointed to some positions, and they're going to go, we're not doing that old model. We're doing this new model. And there's probably going to be 15,000 why we can't do it. And they're going to say, thank you, we're going to do it. And I actually think they have a shot at changing the approach. Because I generally think that young people, young leaders, young contracting officers and such want that. They want what you're describing because they know they have a gut feel that that's how they get the best stuff to the warfighter. And, that's what they want to do. It's why they signed up. They want to be successful. And so, is there ever going to be that visionary leader at the SAE level, the acquisition, is, and I know I have seen it at some of the slightly lower levels in the acquisition world, and I'm just waiting for that the dam's going to break one day, and that's going to be the way to go, because the power of it, unlocking the power of that is so impressive. And that's, in the end, you want to do hard things and you want to do them well. So maybe this is a really exciting time for to watch the change of how the government buys stuff. Maybe.
Yeah.
And there are days when I'm kind of a optimist and days when I'm kind of a pessimist. Generally, I'm a long-term optimist and a short-term pessimist. I think that's the best way to make strategy. But I actually am somewhat optimistic about how we learn from the way that innovation has been unlocked by the iteration that we're seeing, the speed, the ability to ask questions, to fail and learn, to be a learning organization. I have to believe that in the end, the power of that wins out, even over the old bureaucratic ways.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, this happened with NASA.
Yes.
This happened with NASA.
Yes.
Like, NASA got this so right when it came to the modernization challenge that they faced. So, space shuttles retiring. We need a new capability to take, U.S. astronauts from U.S. soil to the International Space Station, along with cargo and other things. We have this massive program, Constellation, that's the same way we've always done business. To do that, it's over budget, too late, and hey, we're going to have a gap now. Okay, let's figure something out. Well, Lori Garver and a number of other folks, both in the administration and within NASA, got to a point where they figured out a way to underwrite the risk of taking a chance. They figured out a way to get people to say, okay, what does it take to be willing to undergo the experiment of putting fixed price contracts out to companies to deliver a services capability that doesn't exist today.
Yep.
And you have enough companies to support that. And effectively one made it through. But it only takes one.
Yeah.
And now SpaceX has carried almost 40 astronauts to orbit. Over the past couple years.
Of equipment,
tons of
and
cargo.
supplies.
Yep, exactly. And so, NASA had a 9-year gap in capability, though, right? And, with the DoD, we can't just pay the Russians to, handle our 14 modernization areas while we get our shit together.
Well, they may be giving us a window right now. We'll see.
Maybe. So how does that model translate to the DoD? What are the things about it that don't work in that environment? What about the physics of how DoD works?
Yeah.
What needs to change? Because my gut has always told me that model, if applied in the right way with DoD in these 14 modernization areas, does it.
Right. It's a great question, probably worthy of a whole podcast in and of itself. I first of all, kudos to NASA to think differently. They almost had to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, their backs were up against the wall. I actually think that's what's going to get DoD to change. I hate to say it. I don't like that. I've actually written an article in one of the strategic journals about what it would feel like to lose. And my hope was that it would challenge people to realize we don't want to be on that side.
What would it feel like?
It would, I feel, okay, so I think I can quote a line from the beginning of it. It was, we're overwhelmed with guilt and shame as we're burying our dead. And that would be what I would feel, because I would feel the guilt and shame of not fielding a force that could do what the country needed it to do. And you'd end up counting the cost and burying your dead. And that's a reason to change. So I do think...
Well, if that doesn't get you motivated.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I mean, it could happen. And I don't want to see a failure be the reason why we change.
Yeah.
There is a non-zero possibility of that, though. Okay, so NASA had a sense of urgency. I think DoD, I think the Congress that deals with DoD has to have a sense of urgency. Obviously, transporting cargo and civilians to, astronauts, that's not killing things. So there is a little bit of, can you do military stuff as a service? We've tried that in different areas. There are some legal reasons why that has constraints to it,
Sure.
and that's okay. I don't think that's necessarily the reason why the model would fail. What I really liked about NASA's approach, they were unapologetic in putting money in and thinking of it like an investment. And that was meant to spur the companies with some promise of growth and future profits, that was able to spur the companies to innovate, to grow, to make a case to capital, to appeal to private capital, whatever they needed to do to win. So, and frankly, it inspired SpaceX in particular to do some things that nobody thought was possible. So like catching the rockets. Nobody thought that was possible. And then all of a sudden they were doing it. So, and why? Because they took the risk. But they were incentivized to take that risk a little bit. You know, they knew they would lose money if it didn't work. But at the same time, they knew there would be a major upside if it did. And, you know, that's all anybody asks. That's all you guys are asking for is a chance, you know? So, so what I am impressed with NASA is they put that money in knowing that it might spur the best of the companies and even more private capital to come in. They jettisoned vendors when they weren't meeting the standard.
Oh, there was real accountability.
There was real accountability. And that's what, honestly, from a government point of view, that's what winning looks like. Oftentimes what we see is that once a program gets started, it is so hard to kill. And why? Because then you now have people who are bought in as sponsors. So a good example would be a certain program, even if it's not working well, or maybe it's overlived its usefulness, there still will be people who want to keep that program going for, if nothing else, just the money that it comes into the economy and you know, things like that. But NASA was able to kick people out of the competition when they weren't meeting the standard. So obviously we would want that in any sort of defense context. The way that it ended up is really interesting because not only did SpaceX survive, they thrived. They're doing some incredible things right now. But what we see is this incredible growth in space, in delivery. It drove down space launch. The overall drive down in the cost of space launch was massive. And it opened up sectors of the economy that would not have otherwise been opened. And so we have what I would consider a golden age of space right now, because we are using space for so many neat things. And it's not just military use. In fact, I think the great uses of space far transcend military use. But the sky is the limit now, literally, or maybe not the limit. But we are seeing a golden age of space now. Kind of drive to the where we could be in aerospace. I see some technologies that are out there that if we adopted some models like what NASA adopted, we might see a golden age of air, both on the very fast side, and you guys would be one of the players there, but also in the neat transportation technologies like electric vertical takeoff and landing. Sure. That has you could almost think of that as the fast and the slow, right? Sounds like a movie, but
the slow and the furious.
But like big airplanes that land on big runways are useful in certain circumstances, but they're not useful in every circumstance. And working to the point where you democratize flying, like you democratize cars, that could change an incredible amount. That would have made my commute in from, on the exit here. The exit, if you're ever coming to the factory, if you're coming from outside Atlanta in, be ready to spend some quality time on the exit. But you know what? Somebody told me one time that if you put every car that's in the United States in the airspace above the United States, there would be so much room between them. Somebody said like miles between them. So we could figure this out, and transportation will never be the same if that's true. Now, you guys are on the other side of that, where you're looking at connecting the world in a way that it has not been connected because of the time. Being able to crunch the time down. AJ, I think on one of the podcasts you said you'd open up Australia. Yeah. I mean, think about that. Yeah. I've been to Australia. It was hell to get there. Once you got there, though, it's the coolest place in the world. Well, there are just not that many of us that get to travel to Australia. But think about if it was normal to have hypersonic flight, you really would open up Australia, and you'd open up the United States to Australia. And you could replicate that across so many different cultures and so many different use cases. And when you think about what that could unlock, it's really exciting. So I actually would like to see us in the military buy into the fact that if we manage this right, we could open up opportunities in the economy to do special things. And, you know, whether or not we can get people to think that way, I don't know, but we're going to try.
Yeah. I think as you're talking, I was just thinking, as you're like working through the second and third order effects of this, I was like, you know, this company would not exist if NASA hadn't done what it did.
Right.
Because two things. It created an environment where private capital could look at a success story and could pattern match. Look, SpaceX was successful at selling to the government at scale over time. NASA, Air Force, broader, that can be done again.
Yes.
And, oh, by the way, it is like one of, if not the most valuable private companies in the world.
Right.
So that's number one. Number two is the talent base. Like, if SpaceX doesn't exist, how you develop complex systems, especially in aerospace, doesn't change. Like, the reason that this company can exist and can build an aircraft that will break the first speed record in 50 years is not because we all went to school and, you know, worked in big aerospace for, 20, 30 years. It's because people have been through a system where in a period of months, you can go from concept, development, build, test, and an iteration. Right. And you learn so fast. That culture in engineering would not exist. The small satellite industry wouldn't exist. The eVTOL industry wouldn't exist.
No, absolutely.
You can trace everything back to that point in history. Now imagine doing that 14 times across all the modernization areas. What does that do for the country?
It's a great point, and there's power there. There's real power there. It's clearly a profound way of moving forward as a country and as a military. And that's kind of what I want the military to wake up to see, is that if somehow we could take advantage of what others have already learned and done repeatedly over lots of different types of technologies and lots of different use cases, gosh, it would be helpful to us.
You know, there's an interesting thought in my head on this, is like, you know, when I was overseas in the Marine Corps, one of the challenges in a counterinsurgency is the military is sort of like this, is performing a function that is not core to the military, right? But this is kind of also what you're talking about, right? This gets into like incentivizing the defense industrial. How do you think about America and the defense industrial base? And Congress considers this heavily. It's one of the reasons why we have a lot of support in Congress, both bicamerally and bipartisan, because they're like beyond the implications for the strategic, position of America. This has the potential to have this sort of ripple unlock. I wonder, like we talked about COCOMs, right? And the COCOMs have to think about fighting tonight, so they're not worrying about, the delivery of the next generation of systems. What do you think about in the balance of like, shoot, is this just another world where we're now asking the military to do too much in the same paradigm where I'm a Marine in Helmand or I'm a Marine in Anbar? It's like, I'm not trained to rebuild a country. Right. The department's not trained, incentivized, or functioned to worry necessarily that way. So how do you bring that in?
Oh gosh, Zach, you're scratching at a lifelong scar that a lot of us are wearing, which is I actually feel to a great degree the military instrument of power was mismanaged through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we don't have time to get into that right now. That said, I do believe that there's room for what I think it probably isn't the same people in defense who are thinking about fighting tonight and thinking about fighting tomorrow. I think you kind of have those are they're not totally disassociated from each other. But it's probably necessary for someone's full-time job to be like what's coming around the corner. and somebody's full-time job to be, what do we do now?
Right.
I'll give you an anecdote on this. So I was the Joint Force Commander simulated for the globally integrated war game that tested out the joint warfighting concept. It was last summer. We had a great time, and they just did another one here that was very successful too. And what I think I learned is the way the task organize within the future fight is not going to be like the 2, the 3, the 4. And in the military, we often put these stovepipes on, like logistics is separate from operations. Well, that's crazy. That's just absolutely insane. Logistics and operations have to be fully integrated all the time. You can't ever, and intelligence and operations too. It's like there's a separate function for intelligence and operation. No, they all have to be in there. So what I think we learned is that it's really all about like who's working the fight tonight, like we're engaged right now, who's working what we're going to do next, and then who's working what's 4 steps down the road.
Right.
And I actually think that a warfighting staff to be effective in the new world has to be purple, meaning it's all joint, all combined, and it has to be time-based,
right,
not task-based. And that is going to blow people's minds. But I actually think that's where we're going.
Yeah.
And I saw it work, and I actually think it's very congruent with the concepts that we're developing. And it kind of reinforces this idea that there is a skill set that we need for what we're doing right now and a skill set that we need for what's coming around the corner.
I wonder to the degree, I mean, I'm a homer for the Marine Corps, but the Marine Corps in its own ways is the most self-contained service, right? It's got its own air element. You know, yes, it gets rides from the Navy, but it's got its infantry element. So it can be self-contained, and that's what its mission's supposed to be as it goes forward. But I wonder, too, to which degree that it gives them some freedom of intellectual movement for somebody like Berger to take that step, right? The culture, every Marine, a rifleman, the culture of that community is inherently more joint, and it gives you more intellectual flexibility to do that. And as you're talking about this, right, the simulations and things that are coming, some of the challenges you see between the services on like long range fires, you're like, okay, so if a ground element can now strike a target 800 miles away, typically you needed an Air Force, right, to do that. But now, and artillery didn't do that historically. But now you have a missile and these sort of like bleeding over in rolls. Maybe one of the questions back to you, sir, is you talked about like you see what is maybe happening in the department, or are things that the department is thinking about to get to a purple future.
Right. Well,
that's a good one to end on.
I'm going to go on record saying I don't think you can have enough fires.
Yes.
So I have no problem with the Army getting fires and the Marine Corps getting fires and the Air Force having fires and the Navy. I mean, we are going to need fires. In fact, I do believe that we're moving to a future where it used to be maneuver first, then fires, or maneuver was kind of the higher of the two. You maneuver into a position of advantage, and then it's just using your fires, or you're using fires to set up maneuver. I actually think that to a great degree, especially when we're on the strategic and operational defense, that fires is kind of prevalent. It's now rising in importance. But to get at your point about the purple side, so I am on the side that we will never fight in a stovepiped way again. And yes, I do believe that having an air component, having a land component, having a maritime component, which generally have been translated Army, Air Force, Navy, that probably is not as purple as you need to be. So I see a time coming soon when joint warfighting feels very purple, where it's mixed to the point that you don't care where the sensing is coming from. You're agnostic to it. You don't care where the fires are coming from. You're agnostic to that. It's all about the purple command and control that connects that. And I actually have seen young leaders thrive in that environment. So I kind of think it's us right now, us at the old folks who are holding on to some doctrine, maybe some territory that comes with having doctrine kind of work out in a certain way. The young people know it. They immediately get together and work it. I have seen joint and combined. I've seen the our Five Eyes partners with our joint action officers, and within minutes they're solving problems. It is not a problem for them. It's a problem for us as we go, well, that's the air complaints job, or that has to be done this way. Doctrinally, we don't do it. So what I see is the first time we get in a shooting war, we're going to figure out real quick that you don't fight wars by phone talking between components. You're going to fight wars machine to machine with purple thinking people. And immediately those people will be empowered, and we will never go back.
I like that, purple thinkers. Trademarked.
It's almost, so not every young leader can do this.
Sure.
But there are a subset within the military of young leaders who can think purple, like can do it first,
Right.
and can solve problems first,
Right.
and they can work in teams, and that's where it really comes together,
Right.
which is where when you get a diverse team and you're immediately thinking as a team and not as, well, I'm the air guy. Now, I want to offer the best that air has to the team, but in the end, it's a team objective, and if there's a better way, well, that's the way we want to do it. So, like I said, I have watched the young leaders do that in minutes. I just think we have to get out of that. Anything that we're doing to prevent that from happening has got to stop.
Right.
And that will be, I think, the thing that changes the way that we command and control war forever. And I'm pretty excited about that, because I actually think that's something we can do as the United States, and specifically our Five Eyes partners and some of our other key partners like Japan. We're really good at that. Our young people are going to be able to do, they collaborate think about how quickly they decide what movie to go see as a group. It happens fast. Used to take us I don't know what movies are playing. They do that in seconds on their app. They're used to collaborating. They're used to having the give and take. And what we're going to end up doing is taking advantage of that with our young leaders in a way that I don't believe an authoritarian military can handle.
Totally.
And that's a lasting advantage that we may be able to bring to fighting. And so what does that mean? It means that we have to unlock that. And I think we will.
Yeah.
And I think it will come down to this idea of thinking purple.
Thinking purple.
Yeah.
Love
Thinking
it.
purple.
That's your book. That's going to be the title of your book.
Okay. Yeah. Look, I am high on the young leaders that we're getting. I'm just high on them. I love you guys have a young company, and it's fun to be around people who are trying to change the world. And I think that there are people inside and people outside of government who very much are thinking that way, and it gives me energy. And I feel the passion, and it kind of helps me stay healthy and vibrant and everything like that. So to come back around, thank you for allowing me to be here with you and to get a sense of the vibe of Hermeus. And it's really been fun for me.
Awesome.
Yeah, appreciate your time, sir.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
See you.